say a few words about the making of this movie, how the movie came to be made.
Primero va a decir una palabra de cómo se hizo esta película, cómo llegó a ser una realidad.
In September 1980, my close friend Carl Sagan, an astrophysicist who also is the person behind the movie Contact, he was told by Linda Oakes. Linda was a movie producer in Hollywood, that she wanted to have a blind date with him. And so he arranged a blind date. And we had a short romance, but I was too much of a nerd for her, and she was too intense for me. And so we just became close friends.
En septiembre de 1980, Carl Sagan, que también es lo que es conocido por todos vosotros y que produjo y realizó, escribió la película Contact, se puso en contacto con él porque una amiga suya, una productora joven de Hollywood, Linda Oakes, quería tener una cita con Kit. Y bueno, tuvieron esa cita ciega, pero bueno, el romance no llegó a nada porque, según él comenta, pues él era demasiado friki para ella y ella demasiado intensa para él.
Move forward 25 years. Unfortunately, Carl had died in the meantime, and Linda had made a number of movies, Fisher King, Sleepless in Seattle, and many others, successful movies. And she telephoned me one day and said, would you like to brainstorm with me for a movie? And I thought about it for a few milliseconds, and then responded yes, because it would be great fun, and also there was a possibility that if the movie was made, it might be able to inspire people about science.
Bueno, 25 años más tarde, Linda se volvió a poner en contacto con él. Por aquel entonces ya había fallecido, por desgracia, Carl Sagan, y le propuso pues, quedar para tener una conversación, ideas posibles para una película. Se lo pensó durante unos milisegundos y le dijo que sí enseguida, pues, porque le pareció una idea estupenda y una manera a lo mejor de llegar a muchísima gente e inspirarlos a hacer ciencia.
In February 2006, she brought on a man named Steven Spielberg to direct this movie. And I told Steven at our first meeting together that I would hope he would agree to the following guidelines for the film. That nothing in the film would violate firmly established laws of physics or our firmly established knowledge of the universe, and that all speculations about poorly understood physical laws of the universe would arise from real science. And he was happy to embrace that set of rules. He had never made a movie with a real scientist like this. He thought it would be fun, as did I.
Bueno, el primer director que iba a dirigir la película, Steven Spielberg, en 2006, contacto con él, y le puso como dos premisas para poder hacer esta película, ¿no? Una era que nada de la película iría en contra de leyes establecidas de la física o conocimiento del universo firmemente establecido, y que sería una especulación sobre algo que no se conocía bien, pues que saldría de ciencia real, no de la imaginación de una mente artística solamente.
In January 2007, Linda and Steven brought along Jonathan Nolan, or Jonah, he's known to his friends, to write the screenplay based on a treatment that Linda and I had created. Now, the treatment that we began with was actually, by that time, it was 40 pages long. It was a description of characters, a story, but most importantly, it was a description of a large amount of science that was to be embedded in this movie throughout the movie. And so it was different from treatments that other films have had, in the sense that it was totally based on science, and science was central to the treatment. Jonah went through 3 drafts of the screenplay from 2008 to 2010, brainstorming with me for additional science all along the way. We met frequently to discuss what would go into the movie. We got together at the faculty club at Caltech. We would begin with lunch and we would talk usually for 3 or 4 hours every week or every other week over a period of many months. And so we had a wonderful screenplay, we thought, as in 2010.
Bueno, en enero de 2007 encontraron por fin un guionista, Jonathan Nolan, que bueno, ellos, Linda y Kip, ya tenían una especie de borrador de 40 páginas de toda la ciencia que iba a haber detrás de la película y una descripción de los personajes, y él, a partir de ahí, de leerse un montón de libros de ciencia y de quedar con Kip en la cafetería de Caltech y discutir durante muchas horas, pues desarrolló 3 borradores más de la película y ya en el 2010 pues tenían un guión aún avanzado.
But on June 8th of 2010, Steven Spielberg dropped out. Steven has a style where he carries along and works on more movies than he can actually direct during the what's called the creative phase, the screenwriting phase and the planning of the film. And he then had a choice, which movie shall I make? Shall I make the movie Lincoln, about Abraham Lincoln, the President of the United States who freed the slaves, or Interstellar? And he chose Lincoln, which in retrospect I think was the right choice. But we were left with no director for 2.5 years.
Bueno, pues Steven Spielberg, que iba a dirigir la película, en junio de 2010 dejó de estar interesado. Comenta aquí que él se embarcaba en muchos proyectos a la vez, varias películas en la fase creativa, y ya cuando estaba un poco más madura, pues elegía realmente la que iba a dirigir. En este caso eligió Lincoln, sobre el presidente, de una película sobre Abraham Lincoln, y estuvo la película sin director por 2 años y medio.
In December of 2012, Christopher Nolan, Jonathan Nolan's brother, and his wife, Emma Thomas, signed on to take over this movie. He is the director, and Emma Thomas is the leading producer. And this, as Spielberg said to Linda and me, you got the right director, and we think we did. Spielberg had done a lot of science fiction earlier in his career. Chris had not done anything resembling this film before. And Chris was much more dedicated to this film than I could have imagined Steven ever would have been. And so working with Chris turned out to be a wonderful experience. He brought to this film strong science intuition. He knows a lot of science, but he learned all the science by browsing the web. He accepted my guidelines for the film, that everything would be based on real science, only to the extent that they do not get in the way of making a great movie. So I worried a little bit about that. But he was worried that I would play the role of a science policeman and tell him what he could do and what he couldn't do. We both had our worries when we began. But within a few hours, as we started to talk about the movie, it became clear that we were both dedicated to a close collaboration to making a movie that was true hard science fiction and that would be truly inspired by and stay close to the science. He brainstormed with me, Chris, on science through the three more drafts of the screenplay. And the final screenplay and movie then preserved Linda's and my science vision, but they changed the story and the characters in major ways, and they introduced a lot of new science through the Nolan brothers. But this means that Interstellar is in fact a Nolan's movie. It's not Linda's and my movie. But Linda and I had a huge impact on the science in the movie and the sort of general venue of the movie, what I like to call the warped side of the universe.
Bueno, pues entonces, diciembre de 2012, el hermano de Jonathan Nolan, el guionista, Christopher Nolan, se postuló como el director, el que iba a ser el director de esta película, y estaba muy contento de que así fuera. Dice que le pudo dedicar posiblemente mayor dedicación de la que podía haber tenido Steven Spielberg. Si bien Steven Spielberg estaba muy contento de esas dos premisas que le había dicho sobre la ciencia, pues Christopher Nolan dijo, vale, pero si no se meten en que yo haga una gran película, ¿no? Entonces los dos tenían un poco de resquemor al respecto, pero al final resultó ser una unión muy productiva y después de 3 borradores más del guión, pues al final habían cambiado tanto que sí, tenía la ciencia inicial que Linda y Kip habían hecho al principio, pero la historia, los personajes, todo había cambiado tanto que Interstellar es solamente, dice, una película de Nolan, de los hermanos Nolan.
And we also made an agreement while Chris was working on the movie. In fact, we made this decision about 9 months before the movie came out, that I would write a book about the science that's in the movie, and that my book would be the only place that you could go to understand the ending of the movie. And so if you found the ending of the movie puzzling, not totally obvious what was happening, it's because Christopher Nolan strongly loved the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick's masterpiece, which had a very strange ending. He wanted an ending that would be similarly strange. And so if you want to understand the ending, I'll say a little bit about it, but mostly you have to go read my book. This book was published simultaneously with the release of the movie, but nobody knew about the book. There was no advertising of the book because Emma Thomas, Chris's wife, who was the producer, and the studio executives, they were afraid that if people knew there was a book about the science of the movie, that they wouldn't go to the movie because they would be afraid that they wouldn't understand it if they needed to explain it. And so only after the movie came out was this book published simultaneous and advertised.
Bueno, pues desde el principio, antes de ya la película a los cines, se habían puesto de acuerdo en que iba a hacer un libro sobre la ciencia que había detrás de Interstellar. Sobre todo porque, según comenta, era la única manera de entender el final de la película, posiblemente era leyéndola en el libro, porque Christopher Nolan era un amante de la película 2001, Odisea en el espacio, la obra maestra de Stanley Kubrick, y quería tener un final también muy misterioso, no difícil de entender, y por eso pues, tuvieron esta decisión de publicar la ciencia que había detrás y explicar un poco el final también en el libro, pero no le dieron publicidad para que la gente no supiera antes de ir a ver la película que estaba el libro, ¿no? Porque no puede ser contraproducente. Finalmente salieron las dos cosas y recomiendo también para poder entender alguna parte de la película.
And in fact, there have been a number of physics courses that are based on my book, The Science of Interstellar, are used in major ways. For example, at Harvard University, year after year after year, there's been a course for undergraduates that comes from the Science of Interstellar, based on it. Some of the movie science is rather firm. We really are quite sure we understand what's going on. When the Earth, I'm going to put a capital F up in the corner of the screen. When the science I'm talking about is firm, some is quite speculative, so I'll put capital S. But all of it, with one minor exception that I'll explain later, really is coming from science, from true science, even the very highly speculative things.
Bueno, sí, pues comenta que a lo largo de esta presentación las partes de la película que se basan en ciencia firmemente establecida, pues va a aparecer una F mayúscula arriba a la derecha, y las partes que están basadas son algo más especulativas, aunque también basadas en ciencia, pues tendrá una S mayúscula para que entendamos la diferencia entre esos dos tipos de diapositivas.
So let me go into my first piece of science in this movie. You saw this as you watched the movie, the relativity of time. So Cooper is here talking to his daughter Murph, and he tells her, when I'm in hypersleep or traveling near the speed of light or near a black hole, time will change for me, it will run more slowly. When I get back, we'll compare, we might even be the same age, you and me. Imagine that. So this was a prediction made early in the film. The film is structured in such a way that many things that occur later in the film are predicted early in the film by the conversation between the characters. And so if you watch the film carefully, when you see something happen, often you can go back and I realize that it was explained earlier in the film, and this is what was going on here.
Bueno, una de las cosas que están basadas en ciencia bien conocida es la relatividad del tiempo, y le explica Cooper a Murph, a su hija, al principio de la película, cuando está a punto de irse, ¿no? Pues que cuando esté cerca de un agujero negro, cuando esté viajando a velocidades muy altas, cercana a la de la luz, el tiempo va más despacio para él que para ella, ¿no? Y a lo mejor, o incluso puede que tengan la misma edad cuando él vuelva.
Now, in fact, Christopher Nolan said to me early in working on the film that he wanted 1 hour on Miller's planet, the water planet, to be the same as 7 years back on Earth or in the mothership up at high altitude, due to the slowing of time caused by the gravity of the black hole. So that was a huge example of the relativity of time, this slowing of time near the black hole's horizon.
Bueno, uno de los ejemplos sobre este retardo en el tiempo es cuando van al planeta de Miller, el planeta este de agua, ¿no? Donde 1 hora en el planeta equivale a 7 horas fuera del alcance de la gravedad de este agujero negro. Y
when Christy asked me, he said he wanted 1 hour to be 7 years back on Earth. That's a ratio of 60,000, slowing of time by a factor of 60,000. I told him immediately, this is impossible. We can't do it. The laws of physics prevent it. And Chris, who all by then knew me well, and knew that I would pronounce things without really going in and doing a detailed calculation to be short, he said, go do a real calculation. I won't believe you until I see a real calculation that you have done using Einstein's relativity. So I did do a real calculation.
Bueno, cuando Christopher Nolan le pidió que él quería que en el planeta 1 hora equivaliera a 7 años la nave, pues eso es un radio de 1 a 60.000, y Kip le dijo que no, que eso era imposible, con mucha gravedad, mucho negro. Eso era físicamente imposible, pero Chris lo conocía ya, sabía que a veces su intuición, si no estaba hecha los cálculos, podía engañarle, y le pidió que hiciera el cálculo real. Y hizo el cálculo.
Now, there's an innermost stable circular orbit for a planet around a black hole. If the planet's any closer than that, it can go around in a circular orbit, but the orbit is unstable. The planet will, it's like a pencil standing on its end. It will fall over. The planet will tip over and fall into the black hole. And so you can't have a planet any closer than that. And so I did the calculation for a black hole that is now spinning, and the amount of time slowing you could get was only about a factor of 2/3. So a very small amount of time slowing. But when I did the calculation for a very fast spinning black hole, I realized that the spin of the black hole drags space into a whirling motion, which provides some centrifugal forces that help hold the planet out in a stable orbit. And in fact, there's a maximum spin that any black hole can ever have. If I take the ratio of the maximum of the actual spin, its angular momentum of the black hole as it spins, to the maximum possible, call that A. And 1 minus A basically represents how close it is to the maximum possible spin. And I derived a formula for the slowing of time, this delta here, in terms of 1 minus A, 1 minus the angular momentum of spin divided by the maximum. This formula said that if the black hole is spinning within about 1 part in 10 to the 14 of the maximum, then you can get a 60,000 factor of slowing. So it was possible. It was possible, but it was astrophysically not very plausible. but it was perfectly possible, and so under our guidelines that we had agreed upon, we went ahead and used this for the movie. And let me make one other remark. When the movie came out, the reporters asked famous physicists all about the things they saw in the movie. And a number of famous physicists said you cannot have that much of a slowing of time. They had never done this calculation that Christopher Nolan made me do. And it was quite amusing. And they didn't know about my book, because we hadn't advertised the book. So it was quite amusing to see all of these articles by people criticizing the movie, very famous physicists criticizing the movie, because they hadn't done the calculation either.
Bueno, cuando se puso a hacer los cálculos, primero lo hizo para un agujero negro que no estuviera rotando, y la órbita estable más cercana del horizonte de suceso, la que le podía dar un retraso más grande del tiempo, solo era de 2 tercios. Con lo cual empezó a hacer cálculo también para agujeros negros en rotación. Una alta rotación, dedujo las fórmulas necesarias y llegó a la conclusión de que sí, que era posible llegar a ese 1 partido 60.000, ¿no? Esa reducción tan drástica del tiempo. Astrofísicamente, digamos que muy poco probable, pero físicamente posible. Sin embargo, cuando salió la película, muchos compañeros físicos criticaron este hecho de la película diciendo que no era posible, pero dice que no habían hecho esta cuenta, que Christopher Nolan lo dijo.
And you notice the F up here. This means this is factual. This is solid. We know what we're doing in all of this. It's based on Einstein's laws that we know to be correct.
Y viendo la F sabemos que eso es un hecho, que es posible llegar a esa definición del tiempo consiguiendo las leyes de la relatividad general de Einstein.
Now, space around the black hole in the movie Gargantua is highly warped. And we can understand that by taking a two-dimensional surface through the equator of the black hole. And then that two-dimensional surface is not flat like a sheet of paper. Instead, it has this kind of a shape. It has a long and narrow neck, and the horizon, the surface of the black hole is down here. It looks like a circle. It's really a sphere or a flattened sphere because I have removed one space dimension. We're just looking at these 2 dimensions of that sheet. But this is the geometry of space as it would be seen in a higher dimensional space, which we physicists call the bulk. It's the 5th dimension in the movie because there are 3 space dimensions, east, west, north, south, up, down, plus time is the 4th dimension. So in the movie, this is the 5th dimension. And this is the shape of space around the black hole in the 5th dimension. The Endurance, the mother spacecraft, is up here in this, and that's where Romilly is left behind in the spacecraft, while Cooper and Anne Hathaway, the professor's daughter, have come down on the Miller's planet. Here's where Miller's planet is, and here's where the horizon of the black hole is. There's still a lot of space between Miller's planet and the horizon of the black hole.
Bueno, aquí ya se empieza a complicar la cosa, ¿no? Ahí tenéis a la izquierda un agujero negro y hay un corte transversal en el ecuador del agujero negro, ¿no? Y lo que tenemos a la derecha es la representación de qué aspecto tiene el espacio-tiempo en ese corte. Y lo que hacemos, bueno, como tenemos nosotros 4 dimensiones, arriba, abajo, izquierda, derecha, y el tiempo, estas son nuestras 4 dimensiones, para poder visualizarlo tenemos que ir a una 5ª dimensión en la que poder dibujar esa deformación de nuestro espacio-tiempo. Esa 5ª dimensión, que los físicos llaman el bulk, ese espacio hiperdimensional, y ahí podemos ver la forma que tiene el espacio conforme nos acercamos a la singularidad del agujero negro, al horizonte de sucesos, que es la línea negra de abajo. Era un disco, pero como le hemos quitado una dimensión, pues sería una esfera. Y podemos ver también dónde está el planeta de Miller, este planeta de la ola gigante, a distancia de ese horizonte de suceso y dónde está orbitando mientras Endurance, mientras está esperando el otro científico arriba a que regrese de que ha bajado al planeta.
In the movie, you see the giant water wave that washes over the Ranger spacecraft, and the Ranger spacecraft then rises to basically, in the end, just barely get out from under the water wave. But the interesting thing about this water wave is that this water wave does not break. And I want to explain how that comes about. It doesn't break, by contrast with a water wave like that on the ocean, which curls over and breaks.
Bueno, aquí en esta imagen tenemos esa ola gigante que la nave de Cooper y su tripulación remonta y luego baja. Y os quiero comentar la peculiaridad de que esta ola no rompe. Es como una ola eterna que está siempre girando alrededor del planeta. Para explicar el porqué.
So why does the water wave not break? It's because it was what is called a solitary wave, or a soliton. And this is a piece of fundamental physics. And it's an example of the physics that went into this movie. Just a huge amount of physics. This water wave is held and maintains its shape. It never breaks because there's a balance between what's called dispersion and nonlinearity. The dispersion is that the water feeling the ground beneath the wave. It causes the long wavelength parts of the wave to try to travel faster than the short wavelength parts. If you go out and watch the waves right here outside the university, the long wavelength waves, they travel much faster than the little short wavelength waves. That's always true. And so this water wave tries to come apart due to that, but the higher part of the waves tries to travel faster than the lower part of the wave. That's the nonlinearity, and these two effects balance, and the wave stably maintains its shape as it travels, which is quite remarkable. But that is the correct physics. But the height of the wave, or the steepness of the wave, was exaggerated to some degree in the movie. This is what the actual shape always is. And it was a little bit steeper than that in the movie, but not exaggerated by a large amount.
Bueno, pues este tipo de olas como la que nos muestra la película, de olas solitarias, o de ondas solitarias, se conoce como solitones, y en ellas sucede que se equilibran esos dos fenómenos que nos ha explicado Kip. Uno es la dispersión, en el cual las longitudes de onda más largas viajan más rápido que las cortas, y nos comenta pues esto lo podemos ver simplemente mirando al océano y ver cómo esas ondas o esas olas que tienen una longitud más grande viajan más rápido. Y otro es la no linealidad, y se unen en esta ola concreta, en este solitón, para equilibrarlo y para que su forma no cambie a lo largo de todo su movimiento. Sí nos comenta que se ha exagerado un poco la película, digamos, lo inclinada que es la ola, ¿no? Y lo elevada que es, porque como vemos en esta gráfica, en realidad solo sube hasta 5 veces la profundidad del agua.
However, in order for this to work, you have to have the water on the planet. Let me start it over again. The height of the water wave here should be some 5 times higher than the depth of the water. But you look at the height of the water in the movie, and that's very high, but they're wading around in the water. And so the water isn't deep enough for this to work. But the answer to that is that, in fact, they have landed on an island. And this wave is coming in from a much deeper ocean and going across the island. And the wave hardly notices the island that they're on. This is a phenomenon you also see in waves. And so there's a simple explanation of what's going on. But by knowing about the physics of waves like this, you can learn it all. You can look at the movie and you can understand a lot about what's going on in the movie if you're a physicist. Just by observing carefully. And the movie is crafted so that all of these things work out just right.
Bueno, nos da la explicación de entonces si ellos están allí dando pie, cómo es posible que una ola que solo podía ser 5 veces más grande y que la profundidad del agua sea tan gigante, ¿no? Y la explicación que da, su interpretación, es que justo aterrizaron, milerizaron en una isla sumergida a una muy poca profundidad, ¿no? Una parte más elevada de tierra, pero el resto del océano sí que era suficientemente profundo para provocar esa ola tan grande.
Let me say some words about, well, let me pause for a minute here. So we've been going for a little more than half an hour. I've not gotten, I have a lot more material I could cover. And so there's a question of, shall we continue at this pace? What we have seen is the science built into essentially everything you see in this movie has been crafted very carefully. Christopher Miller and I had detailed conversations about everything you see in the movie, and everything was adjusted so that all the details worked out just right, and we can infer things like how big is the black hole, how big is the orbit around the black hole, and so forth.
Sí, bueno, quiero incidir en el hecho de toda la ciencia que hay detrás de esta película, ¿no? Lo mucho que discutieron con Christopher Nolan sobre todos los detalles, todos los cálculos que hay para ver exactamente cuánto tiempo pasa en el planeta, cuánto en la nave, cómo es la ola, qué tamaño tiene que tener el agujero negro para que sucedan las cosas que suceden, a qué velocidad tiene que estar rotando. Todo está hecho con ciencia detrás y apoyado en su ecuación.
So let me talk about the tidal forces on the planet, the water planet. Let me begin with the moon and the earth. And the earth's oceans are shown here in blue, and the solid part of the earth in black. And I'm showing you red is the gravitational pull on various locations on the earth's oceans. So here, this side of the earth is closer to the moon than that side. So the pull is stronger than on this side. The pull is toward the moon, and so it's slightly inward here and slightly inward there. These arrows show the strength of the pull.
Bueno, vemos en este esquema la fuerza de marea de la Luna sobre la Tierra y podemos ver pues, cómo va con la distancia, pues el punto más cercano de la Tierra a la Luna, la fuerza de marea es mayor y el punto más lejano es menor, y podemos ver también el pequeño ángulo que se produce en los dos laterales.
From the Earth's point of view, if you sit at the center of the Earth is freely moving. It's orbiting around the moon, but you don't feel the pull of the moon if you're at the center of the Earth. And so if I show only what the Earth feels, then so I remove the pull at the center of the Earth, then what the moon, because the pull is stronger toward the moon up here and weaker there, from the point of view of the Earth, there's just a stretching of the Earth toward and away from the moon, and there's a squeezing from the sides. This is what is called tidal forces, and this is what causes the tides on the ocean, the stretching toward and away from the moon, the squeezing on the sides.
Bueno, nosotros desde el punto de vista de la Luna, desde el punto de vista de la Tierra, que se mueve libremente en el espacio y no nota ese tirón gravitacional de la Luna, pues podemos reducirlo simplemente a esas 4 flechitas que podéis ver ahí, donde la Tierra está como siendo estirada en una de las direcciones, dirección a la Luna, y en la dirección perpendicular está siendo contraída, y esto es lo que produce la marea, o sea, se llaman fuerzas de marea.
So ignore the formula, I'm not going to discuss these formulas. If we have then Gargantua and Miller's planet, Gargantua is exerting tidal forces on Miller's planet, and they're strong enough tidal forces to change the shape of Miller's planet. So the Miller's planet is not round, it's stretched. This is exaggerated, but it is stretched like this and away from Gargantua and squeezed from the sides.
Bueno, aquí la que está representado es el planeta de Miller, el de la ola, y Gargantua, como veis, solo se ve un trocito del agujero negro, y es no un planeta esférico totalmente, por estas fuerzas de marea está siendo estirado en dirección al agujero negro y ligeramente comprimido, aunque aquí está exagerado en la dirección perpendicular.
And so this again is the same thing, but the key point that I wanted to get out here, it turns out that this tidal field, well, it's actually proportional to the mass of Gargantua that's producing the tides, divided by the distance between Gargantua and the planet. This radius r cubed is the tidal field, goes like that. But the orbit is close to the horizon of the black hole, and so the distance to the black hole, or it's really circumference around the black hole divided by 2 pi. That's proportional to the mass of Miller's planet. So the tidal field turns out to scale as 1 over the square of the mass of the planet. So I can just ask, how heavy does the planet have to be in order to have the tidal field be just the right strength to deform the planet by, say, 2% or 3% or 5%? And the answer is that the mass of the black hole should be about 100 million times the mass of the sun. So I get that directly out of knowing that the planet is substantially deformed. And I'll explain how I know it's substantially deformed in a few minutes. But that also, and that means knowing about the mathematics of Einstein's relativity, that the horizon, the circumference of the black hole's horizon is about the same as the circumference of the Earth's orbit. This is a big black hole. It weighs 100 million times as much as our sun, but it has a circumference as big as the Earth's orbit around our sun. And I get all that just from knowing that the planet is substantially deformed, and I'll explain how I know that in a minute.
Sabemos que el planeta está muy deformado y ahora explicará por qué sabemos eso. Y sabiendo esa deformación, somos capaces de calcular cuál es la masa que tendría que tener el agujero negro, ¿no?, para causar esa deformación, y la que ha obtenido que sea 100 millones la masa de nuestro Sol, y también calculó el radio que tendría el horizonte de sucesos del agujero negro, y obtuvo que era del tamaño de la órbita de la Tierra.
Now, how do I know that? Well, the issue is, how are these waves generated? And so, if you, in a movie, you have one wave every hour. There's 1 hour between each wave. And I go back to the formulas. They're fairly simple formulas from the theory of laws of gravity. And it turns out that with the planet deformed like this, and if I have Gargantua, the black hole is down there, when the planet is oriented like that, there's a gravitational force that makes it try to swing back. It's like a pendulum swinging back and forth. This planet behaves just like a pendulum swinging, and I can calculate what is the period of swing of that pendulum. It's 1 hour. And so when the waves are produced by the sloshing of water, like water in a bathtub. If you had a bathtub that's swinging back and forth, the water is going to slosh around in the bathtub. I can infer then that this is how the waves are produced. And again, the numbers all work out. They're the numbers that you see in the movie.
Bueno, sabiendo, como sabemos de la película, que las olas tardaban 1 hora en volver a producirse, ¿no?, con ese dato es con el que puede calcular pues ese movimiento de péndulo que tiene el planeta, el que produce finalmente la ola, y conocer esa deformación de la que hablaba antes, ¿no? Pone el ejemplo de que ese periodo de 1 hora es como si estuviéramos agitando en una bañera el agua, ¿no?, y estuviera chocando con uno y otro lado de la bañera.
Okay, so having gone through that in detail, I won't do so much detail on other things. I just wanted you to see how carefully crafted this movie is in terms of getting all the details according to laws of physics. And then ending up with a great film that is based on real science.
Bueno, es que no va a entrar tampoco en tanto detalle en otras explicaciones, pero sí quería, por lo menos esta vez, que viéramos cuánta física hay dentro de la película y cuánta dedicación a mantener los cálculos y las ecuaciones y que salió una buena película al final de todo.
So I'm skipping over some slides. I'm going to come from here. This is what the black hole looks like in the movie Interstellar. It's a famous image. It's become a sort of iconic image for black holes since the movie came out. And the question is, why does it look like this? And the answer is relatively simple, though there are some slightly complicated aspects to it. So there is a disk of hot gas around the black hole, much like the rings around the planet Saturn. If you've seen pictures of the planet Saturn with its rings. It's a disk of hot gas that is gradually spiraling into the black hole, and as it spirals in, friction in the disk keeps it hot. But it's a relatively cool disk compared to most disks that you have around black holes. It's designed to have about the same temperature as the sun has. So it looks much like the sun. It does look much like the sun in terms of colors and so forth in the movie. The light rays from the back face of the disk. Here's an IMAX camera. They travel up over the black hole and down to the camera. And so they produce this top piece of this image. So that's very, very simple. Light rays from the bottom back face of the disk, they're bent. These light rays are bent by the gravitational pull of the black hole. So they go down and around, they're bent, and they come up to the camera like that. And so they produce this bottom part of the image. And light rays coming from the front of the disk produce this crossbar of the image. So that's a very simple explanation.
Bueno, nos está explicando cómo se produjo, cómo se realizó esta imagen tan icónica de un agujero negro, ¿no? Que después de la película se ha utilizado muchísimas veces para representar qué aspecto tiene un agujero negro. Nos comenta pues, que tiene, en este caso, un disco de acreción, tal como pueden ser los anillos de Saturno, que suelen ser mucho más calientes que la representación en la película. Ellos lo hicieron de manera que tuviera aproximadamente la temperatura de nuestro Sol. Y de esa manera la iluminación de los planetas, de la nave, etcétera, pues es una luz que nos resulta natural. Y el por qué tiene ese aspecto con el anillo, no solamente el de Saturno que podríamos ver ese horizontal, sino otro por arriba y otro por abajo, pues simplemente por la curvatura del espacio. La luz de la parte del anillo que está detrás también llega a la cámara por esa curvatura que el agujero negro hace en el espacio, ¿no? Entonces, parte de la luz que va hacia arriba, que casi un planeta se perdería, ¿no? Pero el agujero negro hace que llegue a la cámara, y la que va por abajo, igualmente. Por eso podemos ver el anillo, la parte de atrás, arriba y abajo, y también el anillo central.
But this gas is orbiting around the black hole at very high speed. Speeds here are about half the speed of light, or even closer to the speed of light. And because of that, there should be a Doppler shift. This side of the black hole, where the gas is moving toward us, should be more blue and brighter than that side where the gas is moving away from us, which should be more red and dimmer. And that's not the case. And Christopher Nolan insisted that we had to leave this out. And I'll explain why.
Bueno, nos comenta que por efecto Doppler, ya que ese polvo de ese disco está girando alrededor del agujero negro, la parte que vemos que viene hacia nosotros tendría que tener un color algo más azulado y la parte que se aleja de nosotros tendría que tener un color más rojizo. Pero Christopher Nolan insistió en dejarlo así y él nos va a explicar por qué.
Now, what he said to me is, this is a very, very bright disk. And human eye is not able to distinguish colors when the light is so bright as this, nor able to distinguish how bright things are. This much of difference in colors and in brightness is just not something the human eye can deal with. And he said, I want this to be what it would look like to the human eye, looking through an IMAX camera, the actual human eye. And so he said, we're going to leave that out. And so we left it out. But you do, on the other hand, you have a lot of glare in here. And that is due to scattering of light rays inside the lenses of the camera. And he put that in as well. So this really is what it would look like to the human eye if the human eye was looking through the IMAX camera.
Bueno, el motivo que le dio Christopher Nolan para no incluir esta diferencia de colores, ligeramente azul, ligeramente rojo en uno y en otro, era porque es una luz tan brillante que para el ojo humano no es capaz de distinguir esa diferencia de colores cuando la luz es tan brillante. Entonces quiso reproducir exactamente lo que se vería de verdad si un ojo humano a través de una cámara IMAX estuviera mirando a un agujero negro. O sea, una reproducción fiel de lo que estaríamos viendo, más que simplemente hacer la cuenta y ver qué colores saldrían.
Now, several years after this movie came out, a team of astronomers called the Event Horizon Telescope team made an actual image of the black hole at the center of the galaxy M87. They were combining the light from telescopes at various locations on the Earth and combining it so that in effect, you had, it's as though you had a single telescope that was as big as the Earth. They combined the light coherently. And they were working with 1.3 millimeter wavelength light, so it wasn't really light, it was millimeter waves, or it was very short wavelength microwave.
Bueno, pues posteriormente, en el 19, un proyecto a nivel internacional estuvo midiendo la luz, seguro que habéis todos visto la imagen resultante, ¿no? Midiendo qué aspecto tenía, intentando captar un agujero negro, y lo hacían con diferentes telescopios distribuidos por todo el mundo, de manera que al final es como si tuviéramos un telescopio tan grande como la Tierra. Y bueno.
And so, this is the image that they made. Now you do see it's brighter on one side than on the other side, and it's a little redder on that side. So they were doing it, keeping the Doppler shift effects in. But that's a little bit different. Many people commented on how similar it was to the image in the movie Gargantua, the image of Gargantua in Interstellar. I find it to be quite different.
Bueno, esta es la imagen que obtuvieron en ese proyecto del telescopio de horizonte de sucesos del agujero negro supermasivo en el M87, y ahí podemos ver pues parte de lo que estábamos viendo antes, cómo es más brillante por un lado que por el otro debido a ese efecto Doppler, y que la gente decía que se parecía mucho al que había en la película Interstellar, pero él está diciendo que hay una cosa que es muy diferente de este con el de la película.
So, what is the source of the difference? There's Gargantua, there's M87, and so now let me explain. Oliver James, who is the chief scientist at the company that did the visual effects, and he and his team got the Academy Award for the visual effects in this film. He said, let's take this black hole image as you had it in the movie, and the camera here is near the equatorial plane of the black hole. Let's just move the camera up to the North Pole.
Bueno, nos va a explicar esa principal diferencia, que como podéis dar cuenta, ese disco que está cortando aquí el agujero negro Gargantua y no en la otra imagen. Y nos comenta que Oliver James, que era el encargado de Double Negative, la empresa que hizo los efectos especiales de la película, efectos visuales, y que se llevó un Oscar por ello, y que por cierto le agradeció aquí su ayuda, pues esta imagen está tomada en el plano ecuatorial. Si estuviéramos viendo Saturno, con el anillo justo en la mitad de la imagen, ¿no? Y ahora nos va a explicar.
So there moving the camera to the North Pole, and then we spare it out because the resolution of the telescope is not very good.
Entonces, pues lo habéis visto. Si en vez de estar en el plano ecuatorial y mirando el anillo casi de frente, nos ponemos en el polo norte, por ejemplo, del agujero negro, ahora vemos todo el disco alrededor del agujero negro, ya no tenemos ese efecto. Y bueno, haciéndola un poco borrosa por la poca calidad de imagen de ese telescopio, pues vemos que se parece muchísimo Gargantúa a la imagen que obtuvieron ahí.
It's actually a little more complicated than that because the gas here in M87 is not in a thin disk. It's more of a three-dimensional flow of gas. But this is basically what's happening.
Realmente es un poco más complejo que todo eso, porque en M87 no es un disco, sino que cierta tridimensionalidad, pero que básicamente es.
So now I propose to talk fairly briefly about the wormhole and then about the end of the movie. Okay, are you with me? Shall I keep going?
Bueno, dice que nos va a hablar un poquito del agujero de gusano y luego explicar el final de la película, que si me parece bien, que si sigue. Keep going.
Then let's take our universe, which has three dimensions, and I'm going to remove one of the dimensions so it becomes like a flat sheet. And then I'm going to bend it over in the bulk, in the fifth dimension, in the higher dimension. I bend it over around like that. And then the wormhole is a structure that looks like this, that reaches from the vicinity of Saturn to the vicinity of Gargantua. The wormhole that we experience as humans is the surface of this, because the interior is part of the fifth dimension. So the surface, like this surface here, the surface is part of our universe, and the surface of the wormhole is part of our universe. It's a two-dimensional version of our three-dimensional universe.
Bueno, pues el agujero de gusano, para poder imaginarlo, tenemos que hacer esta construcción mental de nuestras tres dimensiones, reducirlas solamente a dos. Quitamos una de las dimensiones espaciales.
In the movie, you saw Romilly explain the wormhole by taking a sheet of paper and he folds it over and he puts a pencil through and he says that's the wormhole. Well, this is the same thing as what he explained very nicely in the film.
En la película, Romilly, uno de los científicos de la tripulación, explica a Cooper la idea esta del agujero negro, ¿no? Como si nuestro universo fuera esa hoja plana, al quitarle una dimensión, somos capaces de ir de un punto a otro muy lejano a través de ese agujero entre las dos partes.
So there is a severe problem with wormholes. According to Einstein's relativity, and this was actually discovered by my PhD advisor shortly before I became his student at Princeton, by John Wheeler, that if you have a wormhole and you don't do anything special to it, it will implode like this so rapidly that nothing can go through. If a particle of light, a photon, tries to travel through, it will be caught in this implosion and be destroyed in singularities, places where the warping of space-time becomes infinitely strong. And when this wormhole implodes and pinches off.
Bueno, pues de acuerdo a la teoría general de relatividad, y esto fue descubierto por su director de tesis en Princeton, un poco antes de que él empezara a hacer la tesis con él, un agujero de gusano, en cuanto se crea, casi inmediatamente después, o sea, una partícula entra en él, se autodestruye.
You notice we still have an F up here. This is firm science.
Y esto es un hecho, esto es algo demostrado.
So the question then is, how can you hold a wormhole open? And the answer is, you have to put inside the wormhole something that repels gravitationally instead of attracting, in order that it pushes out and holds the wormhole walls open. And in order for it to repel, it has to have negative mass. And according to Einstein, mass and energy are the same thing. It must have negative energy. And so I call this exotic matter. And I knew that this was what you needed to hold the wormhole open. It was actually proved mathematically by a colleague of mine named Gannon some years earlier. I rediscovered it for myself and then saw that Gannon had discovered it much earlier. And so that's what is required.
Entonces hemos dicho que se autocierran enseguida nada más ser creados. ¿Cómo podemos mantenerlo abierto? Pues para eso sería necesario un tipo de materia que se repele gravitacionalmente y bueno, que tenga una masa negativa en ese sentido y además bueno, como la masa equivalente a energía, según dice Einstein, pues una energía negativa. Y él vio matemáticamente que eso era lo necesario para mantener un agujero de gusano abierto.
Well, I'm going to skip over some details here, but just tell you that this issue arose in the movie Contact, where I suggested to Carl Sagan to use a wormhole in Contact for his heroine to travel to the vicinity of the star Vega. And it was there that I began to think about how to make exotic matter. The answer is you make it with something called vacuum fluctuation, but basically quantum theory allows you to make exotic matter. I'm not going to go into the details, but just say that is possible. The question is, can you make enough exotic matter and put it inside a wormhole to hold it open so a human can travel through? That's the fundamental question. I'm now skipping over to you.
Bueno, comenta que cuando ya muchos años antes, cuando Carl Sagan le pidió consejo para su película Contact, empezó a pensar cómo mantener este agujero negro abierto, cómo crear esa materia exótica que tiene energía negativa, y vio que una cosa que permitía la creación de esa materia eran las fluctuaciones del vacío. Era una manera, algo que existe físicamente, en la que se podían crear muy pequeñas cantidades que normalmente se aniquilan enseguida, pero por lo menos existe la posibilidad de crear materia exótica.
You notice that I'm still having F up here. There's no speculation yet at all.
Es un hecho.
And I want to advertise a book that is accessible to non-physicists, amazingly. It's by Everett and Roman. It's called Time Travel and Warp Drives. And it explains all the research that was done, motivated by Carl Sagan's movie Contact and the problem of holding wormholes open there. All the research that has been done to try to understand whether you can make put enough exotic matter inside a wormhole to hold it open. The bottom line answer remains, we don't know.
Bueno, comenta que hay un libro, Time Travel and Warp Drives, el viaje en el tiempo y motores de curvatura, que se puede entender incluso para que no es demasiado técnico y que muestra todos los esfuerzos que se hicieron después de la película Contact para intentar buscar esa manera de mantener un agujero de gusano abierto, y que la respuesta a día de hoy sigue siendo que no sabemos cómo.
Okay, let me just skip over these things. No, maybe I'll back up just a moment. So, the wormhole in Interstellar was designed, its shape was designed to, by Christopher Nolan and me working together, to make the wormhole look like this when you look into it. So it looks rather like a crystal ball. That's the mouth of the wormhole in our galaxy. This is the Endurance spacecraft orbiting around the wormhole. And you're looking through the wormhole and you are seeing the nebulae on the other side of the wormhole, and the black hole Gargantua is somewhere over there. And so the wormhole was designed to make it look really compelling and beautiful. This is speculation only now because we don't know whether you can hold a wormhole. But if you can hold a wormhole open, this is what it would look like.
Bueno, comenta que esto es parte de la especulación porque no sabemos cómo mantener un agujero de gusano abierto, pero si se pudiera mantener, ellos hicieron también todo el cálculo y lo diseñaron de manera que tuviera este aspecto. Parece como una bola de cristal y podemos ver por el otro lado Endurance que está orbitándolo y podemos ver todas las galaxias que hay al otro lado y las nubes, la nebulosa, ¿no? Al otro lado del agujero de gusano.
And so there then came a time when Christopher Nolan was preparing to do the part of the film where the crew traveled through the wormhole. And so he had the visual effects team at Double Negative do a computation of just what it would look like to travel through the wormhole, and this is what they got. So here you're seeing, let me stop it briefly. So here you're seeing the wormhole is and the planet Saturn. The Saturn is quite far away, so the wormhole looks like it's about the same size. It's really much smaller, but it's close to you. And you see one image of Saturn on this side, another image of Saturn on that side. And as you then start to travel through the wormhole, the following is what you see.
Bueno, hicieron esta visualización, el equipo de Double Negative, los efectos especiales de la película, ¿qué pinta tendría si viajáramos a través de ese agujero de gusano? Que aquí se ve bastante grande, pero es porque está más cerca de nosotros, es mucho más pequeño que Saturno.
So this is the trip through the wormhole.
Bueno, y este viaje a través del agujero de gusano.
So we're entering the wormhole mouth. We're traveling through the wormhole. We're going out the other side. And we're over near Gargantua. And Christopher Nolan, after seeing this, he telephoned me. He said, "Chip, we have a problem." And I said, "What's the problem?" He said, "The wormhole trip is not very exciting." And so I went over to his home and he showed me this and several other wormhole trips for wormholes that had other shapes. And then none of them were very exciting. And so he said, "What do we do?" And I said, "This is the one place in this movie where you can use artistic license. You can make it do whatever you want." And I will confess in the book that this is the one place where we violated our rules. So you can see the actual trip.
Bueno, como habéis podido ver, aunque a mí me parece también impresionante, ¿no? Pero va a entrar el agujero de gusano, está un segundo dentro y ha salido ya por la otra galaxia. Y Christopher Nolan le llamó por teléfono y le dijo, tenemos un problema, esto no tiene ninguna gracia, ¿no? Y hicieron pruebas con otras formas, en vez de la forma esférica, con otro agujero de gusano, pero al final ninguna tenía ese impacto visual tan grande como quería el director. Y al final pues Kip le dijo, mira, aquí es donde sí podemos violar estas reglas o estos límites de la física, y te dejo, bueno, puedes usar la licencia artística para hacer este viaje más interesante como el que vemos en la película.
Okay, so I've been talking for a little over an hour, and the question is, do you want me to say a little bit about the movie's ending, or should we just have some questions?
Bueno, me comenta que ya llevamos un poquito más de una hora y que si queréis, estáis interesados en que cuente un poquito sobre el final de la película o directamente queréis ya una ronda de preguntas. Final de la película, manos arriba. Ya, muy bien.
So I forgot, I may have already told you this, that Christopher Nolan wanted an ending that was as strange as the ending of Stanley Kubrick's movie in 2001. And so we had extensive discussions about the ending. And I'm going to tell you some of the details of the ending that you will not have understood, but I'm not going to tell you everything.
Bueno, tuvieron muchas discusiones, como ya comentaba antes, Christopher Nolan quería un final enigmático como el de 2001 Odisea en el espacio, y ahora nos va a explicar algunas cosas del final, pero no todo.
So, let me just back. Okay. So, Christopher Nolan said to me, he said, "We have taken our hero, Cooper, and his crew to the vicinity of Gargantua through a wormhole. I don't want to return through a wormhole, but I do want to return to Earth. And so I need another way to get back. So I want you them to come back faster than the speed of light." And I told him that no, the laws of physics prevent that. He said, go do a real calculation. And I said, I don't have to do a real calculation. I know this. And so we discussed it for 1 week, and then he threw in the towel and he said, okay, what do we do?
Christopher Nolan, en su visión de la película, decía, bueno, ya Cooper ha ido a través de un agujero de gusano hasta Gargantúa, no quiero que vuelva también por un agujero de gusano. Entonces, para que vuelva a la Tierra a tiempo, tenemos que hacer que viaje más rápido que la luz. Y ya E.T. le dijo que eso sí que las leyes de la física lo prohíben, y Christopher Nolan le dice, no, pero haz el cálculo, no hace falta hacer ningún cálculo, no se puede.
So I told him, made a suggestion. I said, we will presume that the bulk is real, that we live in the universe with a bulk, a higher dimension. And so we will let Cooper and the Ranger spacecraft go inside Gargantua and go near, there are 3 singularities inside Gargantua where the laws of physics fail. He'll go and get very close to one of them that is the least dangerous, where he may survive. And he will then be captured by a spacecraft that lives in 5 dimensions, that has been created by a civilization that lives in the bulk. So a 5-dimensional civilization. And that spacecraft is going to be a sphere that has 4 dimensions, so he's captured onto the surface of this sphere. It's a 3-dimensional surface of a 4-dimensional sphere. And he then is carried up into the bulk. And the distance in the bulk back to Earth is very short. And this is something we know for reasons that I skipped over, that you can learn about in my book. And so he can travel back at less than the speed of light in this bulk spacecraft through the bulk back to Earth. And so that's how you bring him back.
Bueno, pues la solución a la que llegaron fue asumir que realmente nuestro universo tridimensional está dentro de otra dimensión, de otro superespacio, del bulk, le llaman, de ciberespaciales, y que hay ahí unos seres inteligentes que van a crear una especie de nave espacial hiperdimensional en la que van a meter a Cooper. Y una vez que la nave sale de nuestro universo tridimensional a través del hiperespacio, la distancia ya de Gargantúa a la Tierra ya es más pequeña. Y esa ya no tiene que ir a una velocidad mayor que la de la luz, y sería posible pues, que estos seres con su nave superavanzada hiperdimensional transporten a Cooper hasta la habitación.
And so Christopher Nolan said to me, I like this idea, but I will not use a spherical spacecraft. I'm going to use the tesseract. Now, a tesseract is a 4-dimensional cube. And so Cooper would be carried back in one of the 3-dimensional faces of a 4-dimensional cube. So that was Chris's idea. My idea didn't come back through the bulk. And so the tesseract comes to play a major role in the film. He learned about the tesseract through a child's science fiction book, A Wrinkle in Time, which has a tesseract in it. That's where he first met tesseracts. But I think he probably first met it in reading about A Wrinkle in Time on the web. That's where he learned all his science.
Bueno, la nave que él había propuesto era una esfera cuatridimensional, donde en una de las esferas tridimensionales, que era una de las caras de esa esfera donde metían a Cooper, pero Christopher Nolan le propuso que lo que fuera un hipercubo, un cubo de 4 dimensiones. Y en una de las 8 caras tridimensionales del cubo es donde transportaban a Cooper. Eso fue una idea de Christopher Nolan. Y él dice, bueno, porque eso lo sacó posiblemente de un libro de ciencia ficción infantil, Wrinkle Time, lo que es una arruga en el tiempo.
So here you see him from the movie going into the black hole. Maybe we could turn down the lights.
Si podéis bajar la luz, por favor.
So he goes through the event horizon, If you look up there, the external universe is now being squeezed into the interior of, it used to be on the exterior of this disk of hot gas. Now it's on the interior because basically the interior and the exterior have been inverted as it goes through the horizon. This is what you get by, again, accurately solving for the propagation of light when you go through a black hole. He can see out from inside the black hole. He's now inside the black hole. We can't see in. Light can come out, but it can't. Light cannot come out, but light can fall in to show him what's happening.
Bueno, comenta que Cooper, conforme va cayendo hacia el agujero negro, puede ver el exterior, puede ver el universo a través de ese disco de luz en el que antes se veía el agujero negro dentro. Pues, a través de ese aro está viendo el universo exterior. Que la luz puede llegar hasta él y él puede ver el universo exterior, pero ya nadie puede verlo a él, ¿no? Si está ya cayendo del agujero y no puede emitir luz hacia atrás.
So he goes inside and he encounters what's called a singularity, an outflying singularity. And in my book I discuss 3 singularities that are inside a black hole. And this is the most gentle of the singularities. And the tidal forces tear his spacecraft apart, and he falls into this tesseract, this cube in 4 dimensions, which is the spacecraft made by the bulk being civilization.
Bueno, nos comenta que en el libro lo explica que dentro del agujero negro hay 3 singularidades, 3 puntos en los cuales ya ha dejado de funcionar la física, y que dentro de esas 3 hay una que es menos violenta o menos destructiva, y esa es a la que se dirige Cooper. El Ranger es destruido y él es recogido por ese tesseracto que ha creado los seres del book, de ese hiperespacio.
In the movie you get a glimpse of the spacecraft coming apart. You get a glimpse of him falling outside the spacecraft into this tesseract. But then while he's in the face of the tesseract, I'll show you what that looks like. The tesseract has carried him up into the bulk. And he's going across the bulk. This is our universe, which is called our brain by physicists. Brain for membrane, short for membrane. That's our universe down there. Here he is in the face of this 4-dimensional cube. I see a 2-dimensional Cooper and a 3-dimensional cube. You have to add 1 dimension to this. If you do that, then you get what's really going on. And he travels back in a time of a few minutes. He's back at Earth. He comes back to Earth and he docks, or the spacecraft, the bulking spacecraft docks beside his daughter's bedroom back on Earth, but it's docked in the 5th dimension. So this is the 5th dimension coming out. This is the house that he lives in. It's shown as just as though it's 2 dimensions. And this is him shown as though he is 2-dimensional, the 2-dimensional face of this tesseract. And so he's here, he looks at his daughter with light rays that come from his daughter to his eyes through the faces of the cube.
Entonces cuando entra en este tesseracto, en el hipercubo, la nave sale a través de esa 5ª dimensión de nuestro universo, viaja a través del bulk y llega en poco tiempo a la Tierra, donde lo acoplan, por decirlo así, esa nave de 5 dimensiones con la habitación de Moth.
So this is to explain how to visualize tesseracts. I'm going to just skip over this fanciness, just tell you that here is a picture of a tesseract. A 4-dimensional cube is projected onto a sheet of paper, onto a screen. The key point is that Cooper can look in any direction he sees. He sees an image of his daughter. He looks up, and the light rays go up through the face of the tesseract that he's in, across that face and down to the face that his daughter is in. If he looks in this direction, he sees his daughter. If he looks down, he sees his daughter. If he looks out, the light ray comes out here, and then that sees the same location as over there and comes back in. All around him, in every direction, there is an image of his daughter. And you see this in the movie. You see these multiple images of his daughter above and below and around him. I should back up images.
Sí, aquí se va a comentar, ¿no?, que este cubo es tridimensional en realidad, no es un tesseracto, este dibujo que tenéis aquí. Aquí le hemos quitado una dimensión y entonces en vez de tener 8 lados de 3 dimensiones, pues tiene las caras del cubo y por eso Cooper aquí parece como plano, porque nos hemos quitado una dimensión espacial. Pero, bueno, en el siguiente, aquí ya está representado de nuevo pues, ese tesseracto y nos explica que depende de hacia qué lado mire él en su cara que está situado, puede ver a su hija desde arriba, desde abajo, desde todos los lados de la habitación, simplemente moviendo la cara, y eso es lo que se ve en la película, ¿no? Él mira para todos lados y siempre está la habitación por todas partes.
So here you see an actual still a image from the movie. This is one of his daughter. Back behind these structures, you see his daughter's room. This is his daughter's room. That's his daughter's room. The Tesseract has been made more complex by Christopher Nolan. You have these things he calls extrusions, which are explained in my book. And so it's more complex than what I showed you. In the movie you see Cooper kicking and screaming, totally disoriented. That's what happens while he's traveling back through the vault to his daughter's bedroom. And then you see something like this. And then you see him sending messages to his daughter, messages into the past. And all of that is explained in my book. And I've gone on too long. So I can tell you the same thing as I tell people quite generally. If you want to fully understand any of the movie, the only place you can understand it is in my book. The last, I think, 4 chapters of my book deal with the end of the movie.
Bueno, comenta que en realidad los hermanos Nolan hicieron un tesseracto un poco más complicado que ese que hablábamos antes y que entre las diferentes caras del cubo hay una cosa que llama extrusiones y que eso viene explicado en el libro y que al final, si queréis realmente entender el final, lo que recomienda es que lo miréis en los últimos 3 o 4 capítulos de su libro, que es donde está explicado.
Okay, I think with that, with some final conclusions. Interstellar, it came out 10 years ago. In fact, there was a 10th anniversary re-release of the film that showed in IMAX theaters around the world in connection with that a few months ago. It has become a cult film. Cult films in America are films that people go to watch over and over again because they find them so interesting and so exciting. They memorize the lines in the movies and they go with clubs back to the films, the cult film. About a year or so ago, Stephen Chu at Stanford University. Steve Chu was Secretary of Energy for Obama. He's a Nobel laureate in condensed matter physics. He asked me to come to Stanford to give a colloquium about the physics of Interstellar. I said, why? This movie came out 9 years ago. He said, because it's a cult film, and I can this way get the students to come to our colloquium. So I want you to come give this talk in order to get our students to come out to the colloquium. And so I did. In Eureka, California, it's a small town about 50,000, 40,000 people in Northern California. We have a home not far from there. In Eureka, over the Christmas holidays back, I think 2 years ago, there was a movie theater that was showing, if you look here, it was showing during the Christmas holidays, there were 2 nights when they had what's called a funk band playing funk music to bring in the local people to celebrate the holidays with funk music. And then they had one screening of the movie Interstellar. And that was their way of trying to get people to come in. So it's a typical of cult films that kind of thing has happened. And in fact, I have been told by people that I have run into in basically every country I've gone to over these last 10 years, a number of young people have come up to me and say, I have decided to become a scientist because of the movie Interstellar. And so I feel very gratified that we've had that kind of an effect. The Interstellar did sell 100 million tickets in its first round when it first came out. And so that's a heck of a lot of tickets for the sold. So it succeeded beyond my wildest dreams.
Bueno, nos comenta ya para concluir, porque Interstellar se ha convertido en una película de culto, hasta que hay personas que la ven una y otra vez y se memorizan los diálogos. También que le pidieron el ministro de Energía durante la administración de Obama ir a la Universidad de Stanford a dar una charla y le preguntó, bueno, ¿y esto? Pero si hace 9 años que salió la película, ¿no? Pero es porque se haya convertido en algo más grande. Incluso, bueno, en un pequeño pueblo de California, en Eureka, pues ponían la película para atraer a la gente durante las festividades hace un par de años. Y lo que más le gratifica escuchar es que pues, ha sido el impulso para mucha gente para estudiar y convertirse en científico, ¿no? Esta es la parte más gratificante, que no se imaginaba que podía vender por 100 millones de entradas en general.
Okay, it's been a long evening for you, but I thank you for waiting it all out, and I've enjoyed interacting with you. Thank you.
¿Se puede subir las luces, por favor, ya el público?
Quería preguntar, ¿qué descubre la hija de Cooper que hace que la situación de la Tierra mejore? Porque no ha quedado muy claro, queda como muy misterioso. Gracias.
Lady is asking about what does Mark discover, what's the information that she gets that makes everything better, because it wasn't really clear for her.
So the information that Cooper had to send. Let me start over. You see in the movie that the Earth is a dying planet. My book explains why. It's dying because there has been a lethal generalized blight. Blight is a disease of plants. And this is a type of blight that has never been seen, but it could exist. It's one that kills everything. And this blight is in the process of gradually killing off all plant life. And so they need to find a new home for humans. And they have the capability to send people into space, but not large numbers. And they have also seen that there are gravitational anomalies. And these gravitational anomalies must be controllable in some way, they speculate. And perhaps Professor Brown speculates, if I can learn how to control the gravitational anomalies, I can turn off the Earth's gravity for a little while, and we can lift millions of people into space in space stations, cylindrical space stations, with only a small amount of rocket power. And so the issue is learning how to turn off the Earth's gravity. And so in the movie, there are 12 blackboards, I think. And those 12 blackboards describe Professor Brand's and Murphy's analyses of trying to understand how to turn off gravity. And they have one missing piece of information, which is something that they call the equation. It's actually the quantum effective action for a physicist. Quantum effective action for quantum gravity in 5 dimensions. So there is some physics behind it. And all that physics is on these 12 blackboards. So that a physicist who knows a lot of advanced physics can look at the 12 blackboards and understand just what it is that they're doing. But that takes a lot of advanced physics. And they are missing this one piece of information, which is what Cooper and TARS, the robot, they gather that when they go near this singularity inside the black hole, and he sends that information back to his daughter, and she is able to use that information to fill in the missing piece of the mathematics that's on the blackboard, to be able to control the Earth's gravity just for a short time, to reduce it so they can lift billions of people off the Earth. So that's the backstory, again explained in my book. It's very speculative, but within the bounds of possibility and what we know about what's called brain worlds, which is the theory of general relativity in 5 dimensions.
Bueno, comenta primero esa información que le llega a Morph, a la hija de Cooper, no le hace salvar la Tierra como tal, lo que le hace es permitir abandonarla, porque ellos tenían este problema con una plaga muy mortal y que además estaba saltando de una planta a otra, no como las que conocemos, que a lo mejor solo atacan a una, y se estaban quedando sin alimento. Entonces, sí, las personas podían hacer un cohete y mandar a 20, 30, 500 personas al espacio, pero no a todo el mundo. Y a la vez que sucede esta plaga, se dan cuenta que hay unas anomalías gravitacionales, ven estas cosas raras que pasan con la gravedad, y el profesor Brand empieza a pensar, bueno, que si se puede a lo mejor tocar desde dentro y manipular esta gravedad, somos capaces de desconectar la gravedad de la Tierra durante, aunque sea unos segundos, lanzar a todo el mundo al espacio y que luego ya pase lo que tenga que pasar. Pero para ser capaces de modificar la gravedad, primero estaban desarrollando todas esas 14 pizarras o 12 pizarras de ecuaciones, intentando ver cómo modificar la gravedad. Y les faltaba, tenían solo una parte de la ecuación, porque la otra se encontraba dentro del agujero negro, la información cuántica de la gravedad cuántica. Esa es la información que Cooper le pasa a Morph. Esa otra parte de la ecuación que no son capaces ellos de descubrir en la Tierra, y eso les permite, efectivamente, desactivar la gravedad durante unos segundos, está explicado en el libro, lanzar a todo el mundo al espacio en estas estaciones espaciales. Eso que hemos visto al final no era la Tierra, era una estación espacial que estaba en el espacio, ¿no? Y consiguen salvar a la humanidad, llevándosela de la Tierra hacia otros sitios. No especifican, porque el agujero de gusano yo creo que está atrás, pero por lo menos salvan a la raza humana. Sí. She was asking if they are moving these colonies back to the ground planet, or not, that's not the idea.
Well, they don't know. There's no discussion of where they're going. But the one option is to go to the planet where Amelia Brand is. So that's probably where they would go. So Christopher Nolan considered briefly making a sequel, which would tell the story of moving humanity to Brand's planet. But he decided that there was not enough mystery still left hanging to make a strong sequel. He wanted to do other things. So there will be one sequel.
Sí, menciona que no lo expresan explícitamente en la película hacia dónde va, ¿no? Pero es una posibilidad que fuera hacia ese planeta. Y que de hecho Christopher Nolan se estuvo planteando hacer una segunda parte de Interstellar de ese viaje, pero decidió que no era suficientemente misterioso, que no había muchas cosas que hacer nada más que viajar desde un punto a otro, y al final abandonó la idea.
It is remarkable that Christopher Nolan can make a movie that is this complicated, and that where everybody is left not really fully understanding what's going on, and the movie can be such a big success. It's a testament to his great skills as a movie maker. This movie was such a success when you're left with so many questions that but the only way you'll find an answer is go buy my book.
Pero dice pues eso, que es increíble como Christopher Nolan hace una película tan complicada y tan difícil de entender, pero que a todo el mundo le guste y que ha tenido un éxito tan grande. Y que la manera de entenderlo, si queréis, es comprar su libro. Pues no, hay otra pregunta acá.
Con la
felicitarlo por esa unión de ciencia, cine y cultura. Yo creo que es la mejor experiencia para que los jóvenes elijan ese camino. Y bueno, mi pregunta va, ¿por qué solamente mencionan en la película, hablan de los compuestos químicos, cloro y amoníaco? Y luego también el agua, porque no había más en la atmósfera.
First, congratulations for the movie on science and inspiring so many people. And she's asking about why they only mention a few chemical compounds like ammonia and chloride and water, and not very much discussion about other elements.
Well, I think the point is that Chris leaves most of the science details out. He gives you just enough to have some general idea of what's happening, but he doesn't want to go into the scientific details. He leaves that for others. That's not in my book. You'll notice similarly in the movie Oppenheimer, which I think is his greatest movie by far. I knew Oppenheimer. I know it's an extremely accurate film, but there's not that much science in it. There's enough science that you get the general idea of what's happening, but it's a human story in both cases. The human story in the context is some very deep science. But both films, despite having relatively few detailed science, both films have enormous success. It's a great skill.
Bueno, y contesta que básicamente que a Christopher Nolan le gusta dejar toda la ciencia o los detalles aparte para que se lo imagine más el que está viendo la película, ¿no? Y no da tantas explicaciones tan técnicas. Y menciona también pues la otra película Oppenheimer, que también de Christopher Nolan, que también pues, bueno, da nada más que los mínimos detalles técnicos posibles, pero una historia humana que también ha tenido un éxito increíble y que yo le quería preguntar si es por alguna manera. I do have a question about Oppenheimer. Did you also collaborate with Christopher Nolan on this
On
film?
Oppenheimer, I read his screenplay twice, gave him what they call in Hollywood notes on the screenplay, detailed comments on throughout the screenplay. And so had in both cases long discussions with him after I had read it, and he had read my notes. And I met with Cillian Murphy on Zoom, and he was the actor who played Oppenheimer, and we had a long discussion about Oppenheimer and about his role in the science in the movie. And that's all I did. So my role was in Oppenheimer, and similarly Tenet, was relatively small. I'm treated and labeled as a consultant in the credits. As a consultant in these minor ways, nothing like what Interstellar was a true collaboration, tight collaboration between the Nolans and me. I just that small amount.
Bueno, dice que no tanto como Interstellar, pero que sí le pasaron el guión, hizo una serie de notas, se lo pasó y tuvo también largas discusiones con Christopher Nolan acerca también de la figura de Oppenheimer. Y bueno, que estuvo como consultante, o sea, consultar algunas cosas, pero no algo tan estrecho, una relación tan intensa como con el Interstellar.
If I may ask in English. Well, good evening, Mr. Thorne, and thank you so much for being here and for talking firsthand about the movie.
Where are you?
Here.
Okay.
And for taking firsthand about the movie like this. Thank you so much. And my question was also about the equation, but in a more theoretical way. So, would the equation be really solvable, the equation in Brand's and Murphy's blackboards be really solvable if we had data from a black hole? And what would be its relevance or its place in physics today? Like, are these gravitational anomalies something we see really, or more like speculative?
So, if you study, if you're a physicist and you study the 12, I think it's 12 blackboards, and you can find those blackboards on my personal website. If you go to my website, there's It's a page on the movie Interstellar, and then there are all the blackboards. If you study those blackboards, you see that Professor Brand and Murphy Cooper have figured out that the strength of gravity, of the gravitational constant, we call it the constant of gravity, the strength of that is controlled by a field, analogous, say, to the electric field, that lives in the fifth dimension. And there's a model for this. There is an alternative to general relativity called the Brand-Sticky theory of gravity, which turned out not to be correct, but it was a theory where the strength of gravity was controlled by what's called a scalar field. In this case, it's a scalar field that lives in the fifth dimension, and that reaches into our brain, our universe, and it controls the strength of gravity. And so they have figured this out, and they're trying to figure out now how do I control that field in order to change the strength of gravity near the Earth. And what they need in order to do that is to fully understand the laws of physics, general relativity, and its connection to these other fields that may live in the fifth dimension. Fully understand that in 5 dimensions. The quantum mechanical version of that is what's called, well, what they want is the quantum effective action. They would like to understand quantum gravity in 5 dimensions, and then understand this classical limit to the quantum effective action, which then would be able to tell them everything about how the laws of physics work, and how, in particular, how to control the strength of gravity. And so there is, if you go to my personal website, if you go to those blackboards, you'll see the equation, the quantum effective action. You see the structure of the equation, and so they have some missing fields, some missing coupling constants from here. So there is a real equation behind the story behind this.
Preguntaban si estas ecuaciones que salen en las pizarras son ecuaciones reales, ¿no? Y si tienen solución, y si con información de un agujero negro podríamos llegar a saber cómo controlar la gravedad, ¿no? Y bueno, nos está comentando que sí, que existe esta teoría, que por un campo que reside en realidad en la quinta dimensión podríamos llegar a controlar el valor de la constante de gravedad universal, es decir, esa G que fuera más pequeña o más grande. Entonces, bueno, que todas las ecuaciones se basan en física real, pero a cierto modo es
muchas gracias por su presencia. Mi pregunta es simplemente ¿qué es la gravedad? ¿Una fuerza o una deformación espacio-temporal?
Okay, so thank you for being here and asking bluntly, what's gravity? Is it a force or is it a warp in space-time?
Gravity is one aspect of warp space-time. I like to, so Einstein, before he had his full general relativity laws of physics, he got partway there and he had a clear understanding of the gravity that holds us to the surface of the Earth. And I like to call that Einstein's law of time warps. And this is a precursor to relativity that is contained within relativity. And what this says is that things like to go to locations where time flows the most slowly. And and it says then that the key thing that happens is if you have a mass of the Earth, the mass of the Earth slows down time. So time is flowing more slowly at the surface of the Earth than far away. And it actually slows it down by a very small amount, about 1 second in 1 century. That's a small amount of slowing. But Einstein worked out a formula that tells us that with that amount of slowing produces the gravitational pull that we feel on Earth. And so things like to go where time flows the most slowly, and gravity pulls them there. And so from that point of view, it's one point of view on Einstein's relativity laws. There are many different ways to think about these laws. But this, from that point of view, which I like very much, mass produces the slowing of time, that slowing of time produces the gravitational pull, so that you get pulled into a place where you will age more slowly than if you're up at high altitudes. That's the best I can do, I think.
Bueno, menciona una ley descrita por Einstein al principio, ¿no? Antes de la relatividad general, o un enunciado, por decirlo así, donde él lo llama la teoría de la curvatura temporal de Einstein, donde la masa deforma el tiempo en el sentido en el que el tiempo corre más despacio cuanto más está cerca de una masa, ¿no? Y a los objetos les gusta ir hacia donde el tiempo pasa más despacio, ¿no? Y envejece más lentamente, ¿no? Entonces es básicamente la idea que la masa crea ese ralentimiento del tiempo y los objetos se sienten atraídos, ¿no? Por este tirón para ir a esa zona donde el tiempo pasa más despacio.
So firstly, I just want to say thank you very much, Dr. Thorne, for coming here. I think we really appreciated it. And Interstellar, at least for me, and I'm sure everyone will agree, as it is a great movie, and it's made much better by your contribution to it, making sure that it's, accurate scientifically. And mi pregunta que quería hacer era acerca de las diferencias gravitacionales que pasan al inicio, que vemos que afectan el material de agricultura y eso. Quería ver si alguna vez se ha detectado algo así en la vida real, y si no, es más probable, si algo así pudiera pasar, las anomalías gravitacionales, si pudiera pasar algo así, y si algo cercano así, y como explayar algo más así, pues. Entonces, muchas gracias.
Bueno, primero le he agradecido a Kim su presencia y la película, and then he's asking if these gravitational anomalies that the movie have ever been measured or any kind of them in real life, or if they could happen or what they would look like.
Well, I think we're always searching for gravitational anomalies, because if you find an anomaly, it's a really true anomaly, then there's going to be some exciting physics on it. And so one anomaly that I did not believe for a long time is what's now called dark energy. The fact that our universe expansion is accelerating today. And when the observation data said that was true, I said there's something wrong with the data. And when there were two independent pieces of observation data said that was true, I said there was something wrong with the data. These were gravitational anomalies that surely weren't right. The observers are making mistakes. When we had three independent pieces of data, I gave up and said, there really is a gravitational anomaly and we have to understand it. It now has a name, dark energy, but that doesn't explain it at all.
Bueno, nos comenta que siempre están buscando en realidad a ver si hay algún tipo de anomalía gravitacional, porque si en algún momento descubre una, eso quiere decir que viene una enorme cantidad de nueva ciencia detrás de ella, ¿no? De ese descubrimiento. Y bueno, dice que una de las anomalías gravitacionales que han sido observadas y que él no se creyó al principio cuando salieron los primeros resultados, fue que el universo está acelerando su expansión. Y cuando salieron los primeros resultados, pues dijo algo han hecho mal con los datos. Cuando salió una segunda tanda independiente corroborando lo mismo, dijo algo tiene que estar mal también, pero ya cuando salió una tercera vez, pues dijo, bueno, pues esto sí es realmente una anomalía gravitacional. Y bueno, le han dado el nombre de materia oscura o energía oscura, pero no resuelve el puzzle, no sabemos realmente qué es.
Buenas noches, profesor. Una cosa que me ha agradado muchísimo de la película es que haya aparecido vida extraterrestre, y además inteligente, ¿no? Y haya abierto la puerta a poder hacer esta pregunta sin que viendo algunas veces, sobre todo últimamente, en los últimos meses, ha habido unas imágenes, parece ser del ejército de los Estados Unidos, donde se filma una supuesta nave extraterrestre. Lo que a mí me llama muchísimo la atención de los movimientos de estas supuestas naves extraterrestres es que van movimientos de 90 grados, giros de 90 grados sin cambiar la velocidad. Esto me hizo pensar si a lo mejor a la hora de tratar de buscar una posibilidad de viajar retando al tiempo, no podría ser, y la pregunta va por aquí, si está sobre la mesa, el ser capaces de manipular. En el fondo es un poco lo mismo lo que estamos hablando, la gravedad, en este caso la masa de los objetos. A lo mejor en vez de hacer o tratar de buscar una materia exótica con una energía negativa o una energía contraria, si es algo que esté sobre la mesa, el ser capaces de manipular, no sé, los gravitones o este bosón de Higgs, pues algo que todavía es absolutamente impensable.
Is glad of seeing in the movie that there's a mention to extraterrestrial intelligent life. I'm not sure about the movie. And then he mentions recent videos about some UFO in the sky filmed by the US Army and making change in direction of 90 degrees. And then asking if it would be maybe possible, instead of looking for for exotic matter, that maybe try to manipulate mass itself, something like that.
Let me just say that I'm always eager to see gravitational anomalies and anomalous observations. All of the UFO observations that I'm aware of, and observations of unexplained things in the atmosphere, are sufficiently flaky, sufficiently insubstantial, that I'm not willing to spend any time looking at them. And I prefer to look at things where the observations are much more solid and where the experiments are under control and we understand the details of the experiments. And that's not true with the unidentified things. And so I think the probability that there's anything significant there is so extremely low that I'm not willing to waste my time on it.
Bueno, menciona que todas las observaciones o lo que él ha tenido acceso, ¿no? de imágenes de posibles ovnis, etcétera, que le dan la sensación o le parecen como que no se sostienen por sí, o le parece que no son datos fiables, por decirlo así, que prefiere centrarse y prefiere no usar su tiempo en intentar investigar estas cosas, que no le parece que han sido medidas con suficiente rigurosidad, ¿no? Y dedicar su atención a otras cosas que puedan controlarse más los parámetros de vida.
But let me add that I'm happy when very good physicists do choose to spend some time on it. So it does get looked at, but I'm just not willing to spend my time on it.
Sí, y que le parece bien cuando algunos colegas suyos, que son físicos muy respetados, dedican su tiempo a este tipo de preguntas, ¿no? Pero que a él en concreto pues no lo ve, no le llama la atención y no le dedica tiempo a eso.
Muy buenas noches, señor Sol. La pregunta es... Estoy aquí. No soy científica, pero alguna vez he visto, bueno, me encanta la ciencia, y vi en varios documentales que hay ciertas teorías, ¿no? Hipotéticas, evidentemente, imagino que son hipotéticas, que cuando te estás acercando a un agujero negro, como la fuerza de marea de gravedad en ese caso, ¿por qué la nave de Cooper no se estira y se desintegra como en teoría dice esa teoría? Y una pregunta tonta es... Vale. Pero es que sí, en el plan de
her question is about, he has seen this phenomenon of spaghettification when you get close to the black hole, and he's asking why that doesn't happen to them when they are falling very close to the black hole.
Why?
Spaghettification.
Okay, so the tidal forces near this black hole are strong enough to spaghettify the planet, but they're much weaker on human beings. The tidal forces are bigger on large objects than on small objects. And so for the black hole of this mass, the tidal forces, the stretching and squeezing on a human being are about the same as the tidal forces from the Earth on me. They're just nothing. But they become strong near the singularity. But this particular singularity is of a character where they become strong but not strong enough to kill somebody. They're strong enough that there's some hope of understanding the laws of quantum gravity that can happen. So it's just the peculiar nature of the tidal forces. The tidal forces may tear a planet apart and you don't even feel them.
Pero comenta que las fuerzas de marea dependen del tamaño del objeto sobre el que están actuando. Entonces, sobre una persona en concreto, no, aunque hubiera un poquito de estiramiento, no sería más del que sentimos nosotros por la fuerza de marea de la Tierra. Y en concreto, esta singularidad en la que cae Cooper dentro de lo que cae